Joe Curran joins us from the Rockland Recovery Center. They are helping individuals become truer versions of themselves. He talks about feeling whole through addiction and replacing that feeling in recovery. He talks about connection and the opposite of addiction, dislocation theory, and Bruce Alexander's well-known work with rats and addiction. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery. Ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
Kurt and I are super excited today. We have Joe Curran here with us from Rockland Recovery Treatment Centers. He's a partner there, and Joe has been an advocate for recovery for many years. And he has a recovery story of his own that he'll share. At Rockland Recovery, the most fulfilling part of working there is working with men and to men and women, and see them to become better fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, and employers than they were able to do in their addiction. And from from the newest clients to the executive director, each is working towards being a truer version of themselves. I thought those were some words of wisdom that really spoke to me. Joe, I appreciate you being on with us today.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for having me on, both Shelley and Kurt.
So Joe, you work in recovery, which we've determined that most people never grow up desiring to work in recovery or even thinking about recovery as a career path. And because you have your own recovery story, it might be interesting to start there and give us a little history and background of, where you come from and what that looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you say that, we don't grow up wishing to work in the field. I remember the first time I went to treatment, I actually told my counselor at the treatment center, I said, I never want to be like you ever. And here I am, like, whatever that was, 15 years, 14 years later, working as, being the owner of one of the treatment centers. But I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I think I probably, I started drinking when, I think I was like 11 years old when I started drinking, and it was right from like the get-go, right from the very first time I drank, something, we talk about this a lot, but it filled a void for me. It made me feel whole. It made me feel complete. And, I knew that I wanted to continue to feel that way. And, I knew that drinking made me, sort of filled that void for me or made me feel full. So I just always wanted to sort of be around drinking or try drinking. And, I had a progression into harder drugs. I know like a lot of people, they go from drinking to smoking weed, and then especially around my age, especially up in the Northeast, although I think, it's down in Florida and everything, but people got into pills and Oxycontin and things like that. It was really big up here. And, don't get me wrong, I certainly used other drugs, but my progression was I really I drank all throughout high school. Don't get me wrong, like I said, I did smoke weed and did cocaine and things like that, but I was really booze for me, and I drank. And then one of a friend of mine, he said, why don't you try this? And it was heroin, and just like flip it on a light switch, I stopped drinking almost on a dime, and I started doing heroin. And actually, if I'm being honest, it went drinking, and then I tried Suboxone twice, which gave me the opiate-like effect, and then it was heroin, and then I started doing heroin like every single day, and and so I went right sort of from drinking to doing opiates, and then there was even lines in the sand I would draw for myself and within heroin addiction where I said, well, I'll never use a needle, and then of course I started using a needle, and my life really just started to spiral out of control at that point. And I was probably about 20, 21 when I went into treatment for the very first time. And over the course of that next year, I think I went to something like 25 different treatment centers. I was someone who was constantly in and out of treatment. I mean, you could probably do the math, like treatment, people say 28 days in treatment. Like, well, if I went to 25 of them in a year, like obviously I wasn't completing any of them. I was either leaving early or getting thrown out of them, but I just couldn't stay sober. And, it was interesting. It's like I didn't even realize how quickly how often I was in treatment or how many different treatment centers I was in as I was going through it. It wasn't until I hit about like the 16 and a 6 month span that I realized like that I had been through 16 of them, and I was like, oh my God, like this may never stop for me. And I actually went over to my counselor at that treatment center, and it was a treatment center I'd been to on a couple of different occasions, and I said to him, I said, if I have to continue to go in and out of treatment like this for the rest of my life, I said, I'm probably just going to kill myself. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, Joe, in the 3 times you've been here, I feel like that's the first honest thing you've ever said to me. Which should tell you something about the first and second time I was there. By time number 3, I finally said something that was honest. And, I'd like to be able to say that, it was like that moment where I realized, like, I have to change my life and do something. But I went into treatment roughly 10 more times that year. And, I tried everything I could possibly think of to get better. I did Suboxone, methadone, inpatient, outpatient, anger management, CBT, DBT. I've been to AA, NA, right? At one point I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get baptized and I'll join the church. And I found myself shooting heroin in the basement of the church I got baptized in. I tried everything I could possibly think of to get better. And finally, it's interesting. It's like I finally resigned myself to the fact that I was never going to get better. And my thought was actually this. I figured I'm not ever going to stop shooting heroin or cocaine, but I don't want to ever go through withdrawal, so I'll probably I'll find a Suboxone doctor who will prescribe me Suboxone, so at least on the days I can't get heroin, I'll have that sort of to fall back on so I can sleep at night and I don't have to take a habit at night. And it was in precisely that moment where, a friend of mine got in touch with me and he's like, he said, how you doing? And I said, good. And he said, he was sober, and he said, Joe, how you really doing? And I said, not good. And he had come over and he'd visit me, and I was living in theory it was a sober house, but I can tell you nobody was sober there. And, and he came and visited me, and I was in a pretty bad spot physically, and he said, well, what are you going to do? And I told him my plan. I told him how I was going to get on Suboxone and just continue to shoot heroin. He said, for a guy like you, that's probably not a bad idea. And he's like, but do me a favor. He's like, I got a conscience myself. And he said, I can't turn around and leave you in this room knowing what you're doing. And he said, will you go back to detox for me? And I said, sure. And, I got into detox, and I called him when I was in there, and he's like, I got good news and bad news. And I was like, all right, well, what's the bad news? And he said, I told everyone where you were living, what you were doing in the state of your room, in the state of you, and guess what? They don't want you back. I said, all right, fair enough. And then I said, well, what's the good news? He's like, I got a buddy up in Maine, so we'll find you a place to go if you want to go up there. And I was like, and he's like, Joe, before you say anything, he's like, know that it's February, and if you say no, you have no place to go. And I was like, all right, sounds good, I'll go. And I found myself going up to Maine, which is when I really sort of got heavily involved with working the 12-step program and the 12 steps. And I went through all the steps and wrote a 4-step and started making amends and sponsoring people, which is really when I got better.
So he intentionally got you kicked out of your house?
Yeah.
And intentionally found you a center that was regionally distant from where you are? Like you have no network in Maine?
Well, I had been up to Maine before. I had been to Maine before, but the first time I went to Maine, I was only there for like 2 weeks. So I didn't really I didn't know many people up there, but you'd have to know something about the area a little bit. And, I know a lot of people up in the Maine recovery community. I know a lot of people in the Mass recovery community. I know a lot of people in New Hampshire. It's kind of, Portland to Boston's only 2 hours away. It's not that far. And, I did have a reputation. And I actually tried to call 4 different treatment centers I had been to previously to go back to. And they all told me I wasn't welcome back. So he found me a place where no one really knew me. And that's really what led to that.
This sounds like a smart friend.
Yeah. We had tried to get sober together years before that, and he got sober. He's still sober to this day. He got sober, and I didn't. So, he had my back and all that.
So I assume after going through 25 centers in a year, that him just tricking you to get into the facility wasn't enough to be the difference. What was the difference this time in that facility?
Well, it was, first of all, it was an Oxford house. It was just a regular Oxford house. And, I get asked that question a lot. I'm also somebody who's been through the 12 steps more than once, and I've relapsed in the step process quite a bit. So I get asked that question quite a bit, like, Joe, what was different this time? And, I used to give people different answers to that question, just based off of where I was at in my recovery at that time. And there were times where I was in the 12 steps or I was in sobriety. It was clear that I wasn't really in recovery. I was sober, but I was, whatever, cheating on my girlfriend or something. And, I wasn't really living by any sort of principles in my life. So when I would look back at those step experiences and I would see that I would relapse, I would go, well, that makes sense. Look at how you were living. Right? But then there were times where I was, I really thought that I was in recovery. I felt like I was doing the right things, and I would relapse. And those times were a lot scarier because there wasn't really anything I could look back on in my life and pinpoint and say, oh, it was this and that. I would really go, I don't know why I relapsed, So if I could really be, and it was like this time, and if I could really be honest with myself, I have to say, to a certain extent, I really don't know what was much different this time. I mean, and the same thing, I don't know why I relapsed so many times, and it sounds like a cop-out answer, and maybe it is to a certain extent, but I will say at the very least, it gives, for one, it gives sort of this, I don't know what you want to say, but this credit to the illness of addiction, which is it is that deceiving, right? You can be thinking you're doing the right thing and still relapse, and that's scary. And then it's the same thing, which is with my recovery, and I really believe this, with my recovery in my 12-step program and the programs that I work today, right? I really do have to give the credit to my higher power, and then I can't take credit for a lot of it, and I may never really figure out what it is, and I'm kind of all right with that to a certain extent. The other thing I would say is that because there were times where I would look back at my life, right, or my past experiences in recovery, and not be able to pinpoint why I relapsed. I realized something. I sort of used logic in some sort of way, where I would go, well, if I can't figure out what it is that causes me to relapse, I'm not going to be able to change it. But if I change everything about my life, by virtue of changing everything in my life, then that thing that continuously causes me to relapse will have to be changed. And so I really did that, and I took that to an extreme. And I'm not saying that everyone has to do this, and I'm not saying that there's one cookie cutter answer for everybody, and everybody's recovery path is differently. But I changed the music I would listen to, the way I dressed, the people I would hang out with, right? The way I would praise, the books I was reading, right? Like, I really took that to an extreme. I said, I'm just going to change everything about myself. And because there was nothing in my life at that point in time that was, like, so meaningful to me that I needed to, like, I couldn't give up. I just was so defeated and so broken that I said, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to change everything about me, and hopefully this works. And I don't know, I've been sober ever since. Something worked.
Well, it's an incredible story, and it's I think kudos to your friend who didn't write you off, because 25 treatment episodes and not being able to stay sober, I don't know that that's a record, but there's a lot of people that get sober way before 25 treatment episodes, and like these other facilities, they didn't give you much credit either to think that you could get sober, but that friend certainly must have believed that you had the capacity to get sober and that you just had to keep trying, and understood how much the illness of addiction really affects people.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I even had this one, and that's something, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something I certainly took to heart, because we were part of, and them specifically, but we were part of a recovery community, and, again, like, I feel like I'm in some way, like, bad-mouthing, and it's nothing like that. It's just the truth of how everything went. But, like, the other people in that recovery community kind of shunned me. Like, they wouldn't answer my calls or anything like that. And I can remember how that felt. And but he didn't. And, I made my own decision at that time, like, if I ever get to this spot where I can help others, I'm not going to, regardless of how hopeless someone's situation seems, I'm not going to, like, not answer their phone call or try and help them.
Which is a big deal, because it's so easy to kind of give up hope on people that just don't seem to be able to change without really giving the credit where the credit is due, and that's that illness of addiction.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you unfortunately, I mean, you see it a lot. And I mean, it happened to me. Like I said, I called numerous different treatment centers, and they were like, no, we can't take you back, basically. It's a hard thing to hear, especially when you're trying to reach out and trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Hard thing to hear, and then at the same time, you also have to empathize with it a little bit, and that there's that balance of, how do you answer the call every time? How do you be available and be a resource? But at the same time, when you're bringing somebody in who's not really trying, or potentially has that attitude of like, well, yeah, everybody's in these facilities, but it's really just, 3 hots and a cot, but we're all still just going to get high. At some point you have to say, like, okay, is this individual going to put everybody else in my facility at risk? And how do you balance that, right? Like, how do you bring somebody in and say, okay, we're going to bring them in, but we're going to quarantine them? That's not really the program. And so that's certainly messy, right? And if somebody's not ready and it's not their time, how do you force them? And that's tricky. You mentioned earlier, when you were young, that you described when you drank the first time this feeling of feeling full or whole. Mm-hmm. Like, what is that? What does that feel like? What for you? Was it, were you relaxed? Was it a social situation type thing? What does feeling full and whole, what did that mean for you? What did that look like?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think we hear this, a lot in recovery, whether it's in, like, a support group meeting or in a treatment center, or you'll sort of hear people say things like, I felt like I was an addict before I was ever an addict. Or, I always felt off as a little kid, or like I never fit in, or something like that. And they're always sort of like, and I don't even know if they know what to call it, but they're always sort of like pointing at something, or something not being right as they were younger. Like, and, but the thing about it is, like, until you feel something different, you don't necessarily know that you're off, because it's normal for you. It's everything that you know, right? So, like, before I drank for the first time, or before I got drunk for the very first time, I didn't realize how like disconnected I really was, right? And then once I drank and I felt this sort of sense of ease and comfort come over my body, or like I felt my, I felt sort of just feeling like everything melted off of me, right? And I was like comfortable for the first time, right? And I didn't even realize I was in any sort of discomfort until I drank. So once it did that for me, I was like, well, God, I want to continue to feel like this. I remember, I can remember, now it wasn't 11 when I would say this, I was a little bit older. I was probably like 15 years old. But I can remember telling my friends that I wanted to be an alcoholic. Now, when I say that, I was naive at the time. Like, I didn't really comprehend the consequences that came along with being an alcoholic. What I really meant by that was, I know the way alcohol makes me feel, which makes me feel comfortable in my own skin, right? And I know that alcoholics drink every single day. So if drinking means that I get to feel comfortable in my skin every single day, then why wouldn't I want to feel like that? And they would always kind of like be like, that's ridiculous. And it was, but it made me feel whole. I mean, I think it was, I think Bill Wilson said that when he drank for the very first time, it felt like the face of the universe had changed for him, which I can totally relate to that, which is once I drank for the very first time and it takes away, my anxiety, takes away my depression, makes me sort of, like I said, feel comfortable in my own skin, and it gives me this sense of comfort, it gives me this sense of ease. I really wanted to continue to feel that, and I chased that for, that's sober at 22, so 11 years, right? But yeah, it was really just a feeling of wholeness, which is what I was really, really looking for, is feeling comfortable in my own skin.
So, looking back on that and knowing that, or seeing that from this perspective, how do you replace that feeling now in recovery?
I mean, today, it would really be through, I have a pretty big, this is a pretty big part of like the recovery aspect of my story that I didn't really get into at the beginning. But I think a big part of it is I have a pretty big spiritual practice life, and, I sort of have, I've tried all sorts of different spiritual practices, from, the Zen meditation to contemplative prayer to going into different holotropic breath work, or two-way prayer, which is sort of an old Oxford group practice, or the sweat lodge. Like, I've tried all sorts of different spiritual practices, and then service to other people, really trying to help other people. But I think those two things in themselves, so having some sort of spiritual practice life, which is really important to me, and then, of course, trying to help other people, has been the two things that have sort of kept me grounded throughout my recovery.
It's pretty incredible, and I hear the theme kind of throughout your story, is that it's that connection, I think, that really has, and they say connection is the opposite of addiction, right? And being able to connect with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, and I'm glad you brought that up, Shelley, and that's one of our mantras here, it's our motto here, which is the opposite of addiction is connection. And really, we've sort of stolen that from a guy by the name of Bruce Alexander, Dr. Bruce Alexander. I'm not sure, are you guys familiar with Bruce Alexander?
I don't think I'm familiar with a lot of his work, no.
Yeah, so what he's most well known for, is this thing called the Rat Park experiment. Sort of before Alexander came along, there was the idea that, and it came from psychologist B.F. Skinner, and he had the Skinner box where he would take a rat and he put the rat in the cage, and then he would take two water bottles, and there was the water bottle, and then there was the water and drug solution water bottle. And, the rat, I don't remember the exact statistics, but, 9 out of 10 times would drink to the point of death, right? And so that was sort of like the medical model of addiction, which is, you take a person, you introduce them to a highly addictive drug such as heroin or whatever, right? And you combine those together, and from those you get addiction. And, sort of what we've tend to believe, and all sorts of different thoughts come out of this. Like you get Nancy Reagan on your television and says, just say no, right? Or you get the prohibition. If we remove the drug, then yeah, we may have this vulnerable person, but it's not anything that good therapy can't handle. And it was sort of, removing the drug and everything should be okay. And that was sort of what the way that we went with treating addiction. And then Alexander comes along and he takes a look at the experiment what Skinner was doing, and he basically says, well, you've given the rat really no option, because here's what the rat thinks. The rat thinks that you put a rat in a cage that's no bigger than its body, and you've given it two options. One, be tortured, be in a cage no bigger than your body, or two, check out of life by overdosing. Right? Now, imagine if I put you in a cage that's no bigger than your body and Deborah told you when I was coming back, and then I gave you a bunch of heroin. And I said, you can sit here in a cage no bigger than your body, or you can have these drugs here. Right? And Alexander says, I'm going to do something different. And he built this thing called Rat Park. And it was this big giant box, and he put everything a rat could want in there. He could put, he put the wheels in there, and he put the mazes and other rats, so the rats could, play with each other and have sex with one another. And then he would take the two water bottles. He would take the drug solution water bottle and the water bottle, and they would go and they would. He says there were some rats that were like the partier rats, where they would go and they would hit off the drug solution, but they wouldn't go back to it, and they would go and they'd have fun. And then there were the other rats that would totally ignore the water and drug solution. And then he did this other thing that was really interesting, which is he took the rat and he put the rat in the Skinner box, and he would get them physically addicted to the substance. And then he would take that rat and he would put it in Rat Park, and the rat would go through withdrawal and wouldn't go to the water and drug solution. And from that, he said, well, once you sort of give the rat sort of, things that make the rat's life worthwhile, right, is when you don't see addiction. So and he's a medical doctor, so instead of looking at addiction from a medical perspective, he said, I'm going to look at it from the lens of history and anthropology, right? And he came to the conclusion that there were societies, Native Americans said this for a long time, but there were cultures and societies that had zero signs of addiction. Native Americans being one of them, until the Europeans showed up. So basically his theory is that once you strip a person of things that make their life worthwhile, you sort of see addiction start to boom, we'll say. So getting the individual connected, right? Getting them back connected or making their life worthwhile, values, traditions, family, right? Is when you start to get them connected again, right? Is when you start to see recovery start to take place. It's really, so it's something that we've adopted at Rockland Recovery Treatment Centers, which is really getting the individual to be connected to their own body, to the earth, to their family, right? And trying to get a sense of wholeness or connection back in them, so that recovery is possible.
Incredibly powerful. I love that you share that too, because it really does demonstrate the power of connection. And it seems like very much a part of your story. I'm curious, Joe, how much influence and or part of your recovery was your family, and what was that dynamic like?
Yeah, I mean, they were always supportive throughout my whole, journey. However, I will say that the support looked different at different points in my journey. Like when I first started to, try to get better, my family was like right by my side, and they were really involved. One of the things they did for me, like more or less right out of the gate, was I wasn't allowed to live at their house. That stopped like almost immediately. I think when I went into treatment for the very first time after that, I never lived at their home ever again. Like that was over. So in between my treatment days would be spent either like sleeping in a car or sleeping outside or something like that. but as my addiction got progressively worse and I went through more treatment centers, the same way I became more and more hopeless, well, they became more and more hopeless as well. I think it was my mother who drove me up to Maine to go live in that Oxford house. My mother was definitely there, but I can't remember if my dad was there or not. But I'll never forget when I was getting out of the car, I looked at my mom. She was sitting in the driver's seat, and I said, Mom, maybe this will be it. And oh my God, she's been treated 25 times. And she looked up at me. She didn't say a word. And then she looked out the driver's side window of her car and she just shrugged her shoulders. And that was it. And it was kind of like, she was, you could tell that she was defeated in that moment as well. And she was pretty hopeless and beaten down. They would always answer my phone calls, and when they would answer my phone calls, they wouldn't really talk to me about anything besides treatment or getting better. Like if I tried to steer the conversation in some other direction, they would just bring it right back to like what I was trying to do to get my life back on track. So you would see them always wanting to just talk about recovery or treatment or getting better, and with moments of feeling hopeless. And it took them specifically my dad, although my mom too, but it took them quite a while, even into my own recovery of, I think their anxiety of, what I did and what I caused in them. It took them quite a while to get over that. Years, 2-3 years, something like that. So it was definitely damage done. But today, my relationship with them is great.
It's
I
hard.
think that's a time that's a challenge for a lot of people who are in recovery. It's like, I'm better. Why can't everybody see that?
Yeah.
I'm sober 14 days. Why aren't they letting me come back to Thanksgiving?
I see clients like that all the time where they don't understand why their family is not setting up a parade for them to come home after 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge, and that feels like more maybe the 5 to 8 year track of really understanding. Okay, actually, I've created a lot of trauma. There's long-lasting issues that are going to come from this and those relationships, and how do you be patient with somebody else? I think that one's a challenge.
Oh, absolutely, for sure.
What do you guys do anything to treat, because I think the next question for me would be, what are you guys doing different at Rockland, or what do you feel like you're doing there that kind of helps and is based on those lessons you've learned? But part of that would be, do you really include any teaching about that, maybe towards the later end of, treatment, or is there any assistance given for, okay, you're working on yourself, but, it's going to take time for other people to see that, and you have to be patient.
Sure, yeah, we certainly, so first I would say I feel like we do things that are somewhat different at, Rockland, and one of them being, so we certainly have a pretty heavy 12-step influence on our program. And I don't think that's that uncommon these days in treatment. I know there's a lot of different, at least I don't, I'm talking specifically about our area, in the New England area. Like I know quite a few different treatment centers in this area who have a pretty sort of heavy influence, or there's an influence of the 12 steps in their treatment center. I don't think that that's all that uncommon. We certainly have a clinical component as well. And then by clinical, I mean more sort of like a DBT, CBT aspect of the program. That being said, I do think that we do some things that are different. Like some other areas I think that make us a little bit different is that we have a pretty heavy influence with the dislocation theory. So we talk a lot about connection. We teach his theory here, and if anything else, I think his theory gives some answer as to where or why people get addicted. And the other thing that's really interesting about, so first of all, you got to remember that America, United States, is the most addicted society in the world. Right? And he also uses, I think his definition of addiction is any overwhelming involvement with a substance or activity that causes consequences to that individual or like their immediate surroundings. So if we use that definition of addiction, substance, meaning heroin, cocaine, vodka, or activity, what do you mean by activity? Well, that's your shopping, your video games, your pornography, your food, right? Or your cell phone. And we start to look at society around me. Well, what do I see? Well, I see a lot of addicted people all of a sudden, right? Which really says this to the individual. We talk about stigma a lot, but it really says I'm not that much different from the guy who spends 90 hours a week at work. The difference is my choice in substance, or choice in addiction, I guess you could say, or the thing that I'm addicted to, right? So I start to see a lot more addiction all of a sudden. Especially when you start talking about things like social media or cell phone or something like that. Well, I'm not really that different. So I think that really starts to, if anything else, it starts to diminish sort of this stigma around who I am as an addict. So we have a heavy influence in dislocation. And the other thing that we have a pretty heavy influence here is on Carl Jung and depth psychology and his teaching. So we do a lot of work with different modalities, or call it depth psychology modalities. So we do like a lot of different things when it comes to shadow work, some of these different, I talked about it a little bit, but there's this thing called active imagination. That was a big Carl Jung idea, which is sort of like talking, it's sort of like digging into your psyche or your soul. So we have a heavy influence with Carl Jung as well. And the other thing is, and we're kind of going there, but we have pretty good family education. Like we have a family support group meeting here. Myself, along with one of the employees here, we've been friends for a long time now. He's in recovery as well, but we've started different family support group meetings all throughout New England. A couple up in Maine, one in Massachusetts, one in New Hampshire, that turned into a nonprofit organization that helped families financially afford to pay for their loved one to go into treatment. So we had we used to run 12-step retreats for non-addict family members of loved ones who are addicted who wanted to go through the 12 steps. So we have a pretty dynamic sort of family program as well. So I think it's those things, really, the young depth psychology, dislocation, family programming that really separates us from everyone else. And the reasons one of the big reasons why that is, especially when we're talking about the depth psychology piece of the young piece, which is, I hear this a lot from people, especially people, and I am one, and I'm not, so I'm not trying to pick on anyone here, but I hear a lot of 12-steppers and 12-step people say, I feel stagnant. And again, they're always sort of alluding to something. You can't really even put their finger, I feel stale, I feel stagnant, or they say things like, I'm going through the steps again, right? And they're all sort of, again, pointing at the same thing, which is the wells run dry, or, but by doing the same thing, you're spinning in place, so to speak. And, what we found was that there are other avenues outside of the 12 steps that lead to sort of a deeper place or a spiritual understanding or spiritual growth or something like that. And there's tons of different practices and literature out there that you can dig into, and to just spin your wheels in the same spot again really doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense.
You brought up a couple of things that I thought were super interesting, and maybe questions that other people that are out there possibly listening would be interested in, especially, after going through a lot of treatment. Treatment is not cheap. It kind of can be very expensive. And, you talked about your nonprofit that helps fund some of that. How is there help for people? Is there financial help for someone? Or are they limited to programs that really don't provide the kind of treatment that they need, or that might not be best practice? What's out there as far as funding to help somebody get through treatment?
Yeah, so just two just to be clear, I'm no longer, I'm no longer part of that nonprofit, and they're great. They send a lot of people to treatment. It's nothing against them. It's just because I got so busy with Rockland Recovery Treatment Centers and my own sort of career path that I sort of got away from them. But there are, at least in this area, I'm not sure if you guys have anything like this out where you guys are at, but there's a few different like scholarship funds out here where people who do have a harder time getting into treatment, there's a whole process to it though. Like it's an application process, and you have to sort of fill out the application, and they ask you things like, have you ever been to treatment before? Are you willing to do anything? Are you willing to relocate, right? And there's sort of what they're trying to do to an extent is like, they want to spend their money in wise places. So is this person really willing to do whatever it takes in order to get better? But they have different funds for people who have, for people who lack funds, I guess, to get into treatment. And again, one of the bigger issues is out here, and this is one of the things that Rockland Recovery Treatment Centers does is, there's this section of Boston, it's Mass Ave, which is Massachusetts Avenue. It goes through Boston, and it's like, it's pretty bad. It's like Skid Row. Like there's a lot of homeless people who are just, they're there all of the time. There's tents down there. You can drive your car through there. I suggest you don't do it, but there's people injecting each other and then that's on the sidewalk. Please don't do anything. So it's really bad and really kind of sad, especially because, I personally know people who are out there, and a lot of people from this area personally know people who are out there. And, one of the things that we do is we offer, we'll scholarship one person a month from Mass Ave to come to our program. So there are different treatment centers in the area who will, try to give scholarships that the best they can, to people who need it. Because it is, like you said, it's an issue, and there are a lot of people out there who struggle to get into treatment for financial reasons.
Right. Well, I mean, because they've lost everything, and unless they've got, family with deep pockets, there's not a lot of options for them.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it seems to be becoming worse to an extent. I mean, I think the addiction problem as a whole is becoming worse to an extent.
Yeah. Well, and I seems to like, you talked about, in Boston, this, where the homeless are, and it seems like, you correct me because I'm still learning, but it seems like the homeless population, that addiction is a a very huge part of being homeless. Have you discovered, does that seem true?
Yeah, I mean, certainly around here. I mean, the problem is really the homeless drug addiction problem out here is definitely becoming worse. Like that area specifically, like that Mass Ave area, it's always like there was always like a methadone clinic down there, and there's a homeless shelter down there. So like there's always been drugs around it. Oh, I'm talking 10, 15 years. Like there's always, but over, we'll say, maybe the last 5 years, and even within the last couple of years, like it's really bad. Like there's like I said, there's people injecting each other in the neck. There's human feces on the sidewalk. There's people just sleeping on the sidewalk. People are dying down there. Like it's and there's no like legal like people don't get arrested down there. There's no like legal consequences to it. It's like an open air market for drug addicts. So like you'll see this problem happen where, and this happens quite a bit, where people will come from the suburbs to go to treatment, and they'll leave or get thrown out or whatever, and then they'll land on Mass Ave, and then they don't leave Mass Ave, and they're just stuck there. And you've seen other people come from different states who want to go to Massachusetts for treatment, and they get stuck there. And it's really sad, honestly.
Yeah, that is sad, and I think the homeless population across the nation, it seems to be increasing along with, our addiction issues and problems as well. And so definitely, we've made a lot of progress along the way, but we've got a long ways to go to try and figure out what's best for those people that are struggling there and how to help them the best.
Yeah. I mean, there are certainly, I don't want to get, I guess I don't want to get too heavy with it, but I certainly think like we can look at other countries, capitalist countries, who have had much better success when treating or, dealing with addiction and treating addiction than the United States has had.
Yeah.
Like places like Portugal and Switzerland and, there are capitalistic countries who have done really well.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot to learn and a lot to do.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with those systems? Do you know how they're different?
First, right away, I think they start by decriminalizing all drugs. So if we decriminalize, I think it's something like, I forget the exact statistic, but like, we have 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's incarcerated population or something ridiculous, right? So some of these countries, they decriminalize all drugs, which deals with the legal system, and then they give them wraparound services, right? And it's more of a harm reduction model, but they, so they make heroin legal. Instead of going to the methadone clinic every single day, they go to the heroin guy, right, or the heroin clinic, whatever you want to call it, and they get their heroin, and then they have safe injection sites, and so they do that, and then they have they'll give them place to stay. So it's sort of like, it kind of goes a lot in line with what Bruce Alexander's saying with the dislocation theory, which is we need to get these individuals connected again, right? And just like what they've essentially done, and they have done this, which is they've put these people on Mass Ave into one little area, and then it's like a free-for-all in that little area. They did this in, I don't know if you guys ever saw the show, but they did the same thing in The Wire, right? Which is the David Simon show, which is all about drugs and, the underworld and stuff like that. But they did exactly this in The Wire, and they've done the same thing, but nobody's getting connected them. They sort of just box them in, push them out of the way, right? And then, but we really need to give these people, we need to get them connected back in. They need to give them a sense of purpose. And by just pushing them off to the side, there's no sense of purpose in that.
Right, it's just disconnect. It's just kind of like that experiment you talked about, where you put them in a small space and ask them to choose, and the only choice they can make is a survival choice, right? They're going to choose the drug to try and cope with where they're at.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, my situation is too painful, it's too dire, and you've put tons of heroin in this area, and so how do I cope with the pain of my situation? I'll get high.
Yeah, definitely. Makes sense. Joe, it's been super fun to talk with you today, and you certainly have a ton of wisdom and experience around addiction and recovery. So, I imagine that those who go through Rockland Recovery have, the benefit of your experience and what you bring to it. So I love that you've shared that with us today. I suspect that, there's going to be people that want to connect with you, feeling like they can trust you maybe more than they could trust someone else based on their story and their history. What's the best way for them to connect?
I would say that the best way to probably get in touch with me would be through email, which is just Curran, so the letter J, Curran, Curran, at rocklandrecovery.com.
Very excellent. I have a feeling you're going to get a few calls because there's huge problems, and we know there's problems, and there's a need for recovery, and I think you're addressing a lot of those issues. We're not saving the world, but certainly those who are willing to get into treatment and ask for help. When there's a will, there's a way. So I love the work that you do, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it. I want to say thank you, Shelley, and thank you, Kurt, for having me on. And anybody who wants to reach out, even if Rockland's not the best place for them, but I would be more than happy to help out anyone I can. Please check us out on rocklandrecovery.com, and you can sort of get a better idea of what we're all about. And I appreciate you can look us up on Facebook too. We're on Facebook as well. So I appreciate having me on today and talking to me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Joe.